Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. I'm Jack, a weekend woodworker and DIY enthusiast, and 6 months ago I had never built anything this ambitious. But after a lot of planning, trial and error and many frustrations, I can finally say that I built a workshop. I did that. In this video I'll show you everything that you need to know to build your very own workshop, from pouring the concrete base, installing the rubber roof, right up to those finishing touches on the inside. So if you've been considering building your very own workshop like this, then you're in the right place. And if you've been put off because you think this is too hard or you're not sure about certain steps, then trust me on this. If I can do it, you definitely can. And if you want that extra level of comfort, I have some good news for you. I have spent more time than I dare to admit putting together everything that you will need to build this workshop for yourself. So if at any point during this video you decide, you know what, it would be handy to get my hands on those professionally made 3D plans, detailed 2D drawings, step-by-step building process diagrams, as well as a comprehensive materials list and cost estimates, then go ahead and click the link in the description of this video and it should pop up about here in the video. But that's enough of that. Without further ado, here is everything that you will need to know to build your very own workshop. The concrete base that I'm laying is going to be 3 meters wide by 5.5 meters long. I want the base to be a total of 8 inches thick, and that is to allow 4 inches for the hardcore and another 4 inches for the concrete slab on top of that. But I do want the concrete slab to stick out of the ground by 2 inches, which means I do need to dig down 6 inches below ground level. I did consider doing this by hand, but decided in the end that it makes a lot more sense to spend a little bit more money on getting someone in with a digger, and we should be able to get through this in one morning. Luckily for me, there is a bit of my garden which dips quite low, so I'm going to be using all of the soil that I dig up today with the digger to fill this in and hopefully bring it up to level. If you do not have an area of your garden like this, then you're probably going to want to order a skip to take it away for you. You can see this string line that I've set up here, which is going to be an indication of the level that I'm trying to get to with the soil. Before we started digging, I made sure to spray the area where I wanted the digger to remove the soil, and I purposely marked out about 100 meters more than I needed on every side. I also made sure to check that all of the corners were square. I think we're low in this cup, like too low in. I think that's lower than that. So you can see here, everything that we've dug out has actually created a lot more soil than you would have thought. So whilst the digger's here, we are actually going to track all of this in to try and bring it down a bit. And now we are just using the digger to dig a big hole for the soakaway. We need to make sure the soakaway is 5 meters away. Once we've dug that hole, we will fill in a layer of gravel just to make sure that it is level. We will put the soakaway crate in there, wrapped in a taram, which is a type of weed fabric. Once we've done that, we will connect the soakaway crate to the drainage of the workshop using a piece of soil pipe, making sure that it has a decent fall on it. A soakaway is a water drainage system, and the only reason I've put this in is because I do have a bit of an issue with water resting on the surface of my lawn, and I knew that by building a large workshop I would be adding to that problem. You certainly do not need to put one of these in if you do not experience issues with drainage, but it did make sense to add one of these in whilst the digger was here, and it will also have the added benefit of feeding nicely into the guttering once I've set that up. Hiring that digger meant we got through everything in just one morning. Unfortunately, we did get a lot of rain as we were packing away, so I didn't get any footage of that. But this is what my garden looked like after everything was done. And as we're still in March, I've also decided to take advantage of this nice weather today. I bought myself this box of grass seed, and I'm going to use it over the area of soil that the digger removed. The first thing I'm going to need to do is just rake over the area just to make sure the soil is nice and fluffy, and then I'll evenly space this seed on top. I'll keep you guys up to date with how this progresses throughout the workshop build. Oh, I'm just seeding my grass again. So yesterday we dug a big hole in the ground and now we are ready to fill this hole with 5 tons of type 1 hardcore. Looking at this diagram, I knew that I needed 100 millimeters of hardcore covering an area of 5.7 meters by 3.2 meters. There are several calculators online that allow you to quickly work this out, and I'll have the link to the one that I use in the description below. And if you were wondering, this is what 5 tons of hardcore looks like. Luckily, I didn't have to move it alone. I did have 2 friends helping me out for the entire day. And unfortunately, my house does sit on the top of a little hill, so every single wheelbarrow needed to be pushed up this. Come on! In the end, we moved the first half of hardcore in just over 1 hour. We now just need to get the compactor out and make sure that this is all compacted before putting in the other half. For this, we're going to be using this compactor. It's a little petrol compactor by Evolution. It's plenty for what we need. So we're going to go over in each direction. I think you're meant to do it 7 times. I read somewhere online. And once we've done that, we will move the other half of the hardcore into place. So now we have compacted that first layer of hardcore. We have gone around the edges of where the workshop will be built and identified that this here is the high point. We've then put in a stake and marked a pencil line at the 2 inches above the highest point, just so we've got a consistent guide as we level the rest of this off. I'm also borrowing one of these pieces of kit for the day, which is an industrial laser level. Essentially what this does is it's got a sensor on here, and when this is level with this, it starts to beep. And what we're aiming for is a consistent tone, which means that we are level with this. Future Jack here editing this video, and I'm not sure why I didn't say this at the time, but you definitely don't need to get one of these laser levels to actually level this out. I only got one of these because the guy that drove that digger lent me it for the day. If you do not have access to one, then you can just use a spirit level. They're absolutely fine. Don't worry about it. And then it is just a case of going around with this and checking that we're at the right levels the entire way along before we give it one last compaction. Okay, so after 4 hours of moving hardcore and compacting for probably another hour, the hardcore is now down. I'm pretty confident that it's mostly level. From checking on the laser level, it's all within about 15 millimeters of itself, and any slight imperfections I'll get out with the layer of sand that goes on top of this. The next thing I need to do is build the frame using 2x4s around the outside. So yeah, let's crack on. To do this, I have ordered myself these 2x4s. Now, I couldn't find anywhere that stocked these in 5.5 meter lengths. So the first thing I'm doing is actually joining 2 of these lengths to make up the longest side. Now, because I'm doing this on my own, I am using 2 clamps on the width of these, and that's really just to make sure that as I screw these together, this is going to actually form one completely straight length of timber. And the reason that I got the digger to remove an additional 100 mil on all of the sides was to make sure that there would be plenty of hardcore under the timber frame so I could rest the frame on it. The benefits of doing this means that when I remove that timber frame later on, that there will be no risk of the hardcore falling away from underneath the concrete and creating weak spots. And on the face of it, this does sound like quite a simple step, but I would argue that out of everything that you do to put a concrete base down, this is actually where you want to spend most of your time. There's 2 things specifically that you need to make sure are absolutely perfect. Firstly, is that all of your corners are square. So the overall rectangular shape that you're making does have 4 90-degree corners. You also want to make sure that it isn't bowing in the middle, and you do that by measuring the width at several different places throughout the entire length once you've actually laid this in. Secondly, you are going to want to make sure that this thing is absolutely level, and you can do that by grabbing a spirit level and making sure that as you bang in these stakes that are going to hold this into the ground, that bubble is sat right in the center. Yes, look at that. Perfect. Right, so now I've screwed this length in, I can see that this piece of timber here isn't quite level. It's showing that it wants to come up about an inch on that end. So I'm going to lift at the end and then scrape a bit of hardcore under it just to get the level. And then I'll make sure that this is nicely secure just so it doesn't go anywhere when I pour the concrete. And before I put the last side of the frame on, I've decided that I'm going to move some of the sand in here, just so I do not keep knocking it as I go over it. Now, the only reason that you actually put a layer of building sand on top of the hardcore is to make a barrier that will prevent your damp-proof membrane being pierced. If you don't do this and your damp-proof membrane does get a hole in it, then you will be letting moisture through, which negates the purpose of having the damp-proof membrane there overall. In my diagram here, I've said allow for 25 millimeters, but you might find that you don't actually need this. Really, it's just to give you a flat area. 5, 6, 4. I've just been measuring the long edges of the frame that I've built so far, and for reasons that I do not yet understand, there is a slight discrepancy between the length. It's looking like this length here, so from that corner to that corner, is 10 mil longer than the other corner to that corner there. So I'm going to do what most people should do in this situation. Dad, I need your help. Luckily, my dad rocked up with this building square. It turned out that one of the side lengths of timber was about 10 mil out. So I used some packers to bring that back in a little bit and then screwed on the front side of the frame. And with the frame finished, we moved in the rest of the building sand and used this DIY rake to get everything roughly even. So as you can see behind me, we are now just compacting that layer of sand. We've checked every single corner 3 times. We've also measured the distance across in several areas, and this is bang on. So we're happy, it's good. Now that the sand is compacted, we are ready to put the damp-proof membrane on this. I'm not going to do that yet because we are forecast rain for the next few days. And if I put it down, I will essentially have made myself a very shallow swimming pool. So I'm going to do that just before the concrete arrives at the weekend.
Several long days later.
Now the time at the moment is 20 past 8 and I have 2 meters of concrete turning up at 10 o'clock. So I need to get this polythene down and put these steels in the next 1 hour and 40 minutes. So I'm going to just crack on with it. So the trick when you're putting this polythene in is just making sure that you've got it pushed in right at the corners. So when you actually pour your concrete, you're not going to have any weak spots where it's not as deep. So we have just gone around taking our time and just make sure this is really nicely pushed in into all of the edges. After the damp-proof membrane is in, I did just need to lay in the steel mesh sheets. If I'm honest, this is a little bit belt and braces for a workshop. So if you are looking to make a saving, you could probably skip this step and save yourself about £150. Before putting in the steel mesh, I did make sure to cut them down so there was a gap of 100 mil around all of the edges, just to make sure that we do not pierce the damp-proof membrane. After that, I attached each of the mesh panels together using this wire, just to make sure that they don't come apart once we're standing on them pouring the concrete. Okay, so that is the polythene and the steels in. So now we are just waiting on the concrete truck to turn up in 50 minutes to get everything poured. And luckily both the concrete as well as some of my friends turned up right on time. So let's do it. So you can see that I'm working really hard tamping out this concrete. I don't know who these people are, they just turned up. Yeah, that looks good, that. And the trick to getting a nice, level and smooth surface for your concrete is referred to as tamping, which is essentially when you make a sawing motion with a long stretch of wood over the length of your timber frame. So that is all of the concrete tamped out. Turns out it's a lot easier if you've got 6 people helping you. This should dry overnight, so I'll check back in tomorrow and see how this has got on. I've given it a couple of days to dry. So this morning I went around the edge of the concrete base and removed the timber frame. I did notice when I folded back the damp-proof membrane that the top edge is a little bit sharp. So I have gone around and just made sure to knock all of that off. So when I fold that damp-proof membrane back over, that it doesn't pierce it. And here it is, all finished and ready to go. I was adding up the total cost of this morning, and I know I've been flashing it on the screen throughout this video, but if you add everything up, the total price of installing this concrete base come to £1,250, which I think is pretty good. I also think that if you are on a really tight budget, you could deduct things like the steel mesh and potentially the use of a digger and get it a little bit closer to £1,000. Now, earlier last week, Heavies came along and dropped off all of the timber that I'm going to need to build both the walls as well as the roof. I now need to spend probably most of the day moving this into the back garden. And trust me, carrying all of that to the end of my garden took a really long time. I decided to move all of the wood over 3 days because doing it in one hit would have been too much. Man, I feel like my arm's gonna fall off. All of the timber that I'm going to be using today is this. This is 4 inches by 2 inches. This is going to give you a very structurally solid build. You can go for slightly thinner pieces of timber, but I didn't want to, mainly because this is a workshop and I'm going to be hanging quite a lot of things off of the walls. And on the outside of all of our framed walls, we will be applying this 18mm OSB 3 sheeting. And before we start to build the walls this morning, I have just gone around the edges and flapped over all of that damp-proof membrane, just so it's not getting in our way. If I'm honest, I do slightly regret taking up the framing around the outside. I think in hindsight, I probably would have left that on until after the walls were built. But we are where we are. I feel like I've been blessed by the weather gods today because every day this week it is forecast not to have rained. And I'm not joking, every single day we have had a pretty much torrential downpour. So to have a sunny, albeit chilly day like this really is a blessing. And we are going to be starting off by building the back wall. And the main reason that we are building the back wall first is because it is the simplest one. This is just a long rectangular wall with no windows, no doors. So it will be really good to get us into the flow of things. I'm not going to be going through all of the measurements in this video because in the description you will find detailed plans which are free for you to download and you can reference them as you need to. All I am going to say about the back wall is it is 5.5 meters wide and it will be 2,180 millimeters tall. So let's get on with it. Okay, so we're going to start off by cutting down all of the 4x2s to the correct height for the back wall. Whilst I've got Chris here cutting them down, I'm going to be screwing them together over on the concrete. So when it actually comes to plasterboarding the walls on the inside, I do want to make sure that the back wall has somewhere for the plasterboard to actually attach onto. And the way I'm going to mark out where this next piece of wood needs to go is by just getting an offcut here and marking exactly where that will fall. So I know that when I drill the side wall into here, that is going to come up to here. So I want to now fix my next piece of wood right there. Now I want every single one of these uprights to be spaced apart by 400 millimeters, which is right here on the tape measure. However, what I don't want to do is measure it every single time. So in order to speed this up, I am going to get Chris to cut me a little offcut that'll just slide in here and then butt the wood up against. So 400 minus the width of one of these, that's 355 millimeters that we need an offcut cut to, Chris. So now you can see why these pieces are useful, because we can just stick them in between each of the uprights and then we're not having to mark out with a tape measure every single time where the 400 spacing should be. Now, because the length of the workshop is 5.5 meters long and the longest piece of 4x2 that I could find was 4.8 meters, we have just had to cut off the extra here and we're going to be attaching them or bracing them together using one of these pieces. So the plan here is just to position this, which is the exact gap in between the two uprights, using a couple of screws, and then that will make up for the full length and we'll be able to finish off the back wall. So this is the back wall done. That took just over 1 hour, and just to get a feel for the height, we're going to lift it up just to check everything looks right. 3, 2, 1. That's big. The next thing we want to do is actually put the OSB sheets on this. And the reason we're doing that is we know that the OSB sheets come out of the factory perfectly square. So we'll be able to use these to sort of pull this into square. These are quite heavy. So this is about to go from heavy to very heavy. So you can see here that now we've put that OSB sheet on, we are dead straight with this edge. But it is ever so slightly not quite on it there. So we're just going to use some screws to pull the frame into shape. And the way we do this is by putting a set of screws along one edge of the OSB and then pushing the side of that panel so it's buttered up nicely against the frame. And that should be enough to pull everything into shape. Now right here, it looks like the frame is actually bowing inwards a little bit. And there's a nice little trick I've got for pulling it out. So I'm going to put a screw in here and I'm going to grab a hammer, pull that out ever so slightly. So we know that that's now square, and the rest of these will be falling in lovely. And now obviously the OSB board that we've put on this is currently its full length. So we do just want to make sure that the top of it is actually cut off so we don't have any dangling above the top of the workshop. And to do that, we are going to use this Evolution track saw. So the back wall is now built, the OSB has been screwed onto it, and this is leaning up against the fence. It did weigh an absolute ton, so I'm not sure how anyone would do this on their own, so make sure you've got a friend with you. The next thing we're going to do is build the two side walls, and because this is leaning against the fence, we have the whole of the concrete area to do that on. Once we've got the two ends built, we'll screw this together so we don't have to put all of that weight on the fence, because I am a bit worried it's going to fall down. Now the sidewall that we're doing here doesn't have a window in it, so this should be fairly straightforward to do. The only difference with the side is that these do need to have a fall on them, and that is for the roof to make sure that the water can run off of the roof and into the guttering that's on the back. Now building regulations stipulate that a flat roof should have a pitch of 1 in 80, which means for every 80 centimetres, it needs to drop 1 centimetre. So we are going a little bit above that, and that's a good thing. The width of this side wall is 2.8 meters. The difference between the back and the front is 70 mil. So we are going to cut 7 uprights in between here, each one 10 mil longer than the previous. And what that should give us is 7 perfectly distanced out uprights that allow for the fall on the top. So now with that slanted side piece done, we have put on one of the OSB sheets. And again, that's just to make sure that it is square for the reasons that I said earlier on. And then we'll do the other pieces once we've actually got these two sides screwed together. So the reason we have lifted up this side without all the bits in is this end is going to have a window in. And whilst it's all well and good having a plan, sometimes you do just need to eyeball things as you go. And the thing that I wasn't sure of is how high I actually want that window off of the ground and sort of where I want it positioned. I think looking at this now, I do want it further in that side of the wall as opposed to central. So I do think that we'll butt it up against here. The other thing we need to do is just make sure that as we push these walls in, that this polythene is nicely pushed back. Now this is essentially acting as a damp-proof membrane between the wood and the concrete. So if any moisture does come up through the concrete, it isn't going to penetrate into the wood and cause a damp issue there. Now, as you can see, this is the second of the side walls. So this also has the slanted roof. The only difference is this one does have a window in it. Now, I haven't gone through and read out all the measurements again, because you can find the free plans to this build in the description of the video. The main things that you need to know is that this window is going to rest on this piece here, and we've made sure that it is very well supported underneath, because these double glazed windows do have quite a lot of weight to them. You just want to make sure that that's not going to go anywhere. So we are just going to get this next one finished up, and then we'll actually be able to get the 3 walls together and start to get a feel for how big this workshop will be. It's exciting. It's good. Okay, so that is 3 of the walls done, which means we are finally ready to start actually putting these in position. I'm just going to go and put little man inside because I don't want to crush him. He's enjoying it. And then the next thing we are going to do is actually screw all of these together. And I've decided to leave this footage in as a warning to why you should always have one person holding a wall. As if you tried to catch that. Fair play. You're right.
Yeah.
Luckily, Chris was absolutely fine and didn't break both of his wrists. And we definitely learned a lesson moving forwards that day. God, could you imagine if it hit a camera? And now that these walls are in, we are just checking all of the corners of the 3 just to make sure that they are perfectly square, and that one is looking bang on. So the next thing we want to do is just drill a few holes in the bottom frame here, the bottom plate, and using these concrete screws, drill about every metre or so around the edge. So one thing that has changed today is, as we've been building this, I've realised that 2 windows and the door with glass is probably too much. So I am going to take Mark's advice from Start Making Woodworking and just have the 1 window and 1 door. Me and Chris have just made up this part of the wall for the front, so we're going to get this in. Okay, so we have put that bit of the front in. Chris is just carrying in this other little small piece here. We'll need just screwing in, yeah?
Yep.
Now most of the front wall is actually done. We've got these 2 little bits on. We are just cutting these slightly shorter. And the reason that they are slightly shorter in terms of the height is because there is going to be a 2x6, or actually 2 2x6s bolted together going along here. And that's going to give the strength above the door to hold all of the 2x6s for the rafters as well. So we're just going to get this last bit built up, and then we will put the 6-inch beam along the top. Okay, so the last thing that we are doing before we finish up for the day is just getting this beam braced along the top. Okay, so we are coming up to the time where we need to call it a day, but we have got most of the walls and framing done in the 6 hours that we allotted today, which I think is actually a really good job. I've had a bit more time this morning to check the levels of all of the walls and make sure that the distance between the end walls and the side walls are consistent. And luckily everything was bang on. The only thing that I have noticed this morning is that this bit isn't right. If I put a spirit level on this side of what will be the French doors on the front of the workshop, I am out probably by almost an inch, which means it's leaning that way just a little bit. And just to explain a little bit more about the cause of the leaning side here, essentially what needs to happen is this whole bit, as I'm pulling it in, hopefully you can see that, that needs to sort of be permanently pulled in that position, and putting the OSB on the outside of this little panel here should fix that. So I'm going to cut down the OSB that I need to that size, and then I've got my dad turning up in a minute because this really is a 2-person job just to get that pulled in. Once I've done that, I will cut down the beam that goes above it just to make sure it fits in there. With that problem out of the way, I could now move on to fitting the rest of the OSB on the walls. The bit I just cut was to fill in this panel here. But check this out. This is the offcut. Don't you just love it when that happens? Result. So I was about to use a full panel for underneath this window here on the end, but I just realised that this would be a really useful place to use up all of those offcuts that I've got from doing the walls. So I've just cut them down and I just need to run through and actually get these on. So now we have covered all of the outside of the walls in this OSB. The last thing we need to do is just cover all of this in a permeable felt, which will protect it from the weather should it rain, and it is likely to rain, and it's also breathable, so if the wood does sweat, it allows that moisture to be released as well. And luckily, fitting this felt to the side of the walls is a very straightforward thing to do. We found it was a lot easier for the bottom layer to draw a pencil line using a spirit level, and then we knew exactly where this felt needed to touch before it was stapled on. For the remaining 2 layers above that, we could just follow the lap line, which is this grey line here, to make sure that the felt was landing in the right place. And even though this felt isn't fully waterproof, it's certainly going to go a long way in helping keeping that OSB board dry before I clad it in a few weekends' time. And that is the walls fully felted and a temporary tarp up, and I cannot tell you how happy I am to be finally taking this tarp off. It has rained a lot in the last couple of weeks since we actually built the walls, and this tarp was not particularly waterproof. As you can see here, the inside of the workshop did get quite wet throughout that rainy weather. Luckily, I do think that a couple of dry days will dry all of this out, and there'll be no negative effects in the long run. So before I get started on the rafters this morning, the first thing that I want to address is the width along the centre of the workshop. For anyone that watched the last episode, you will know that this front wall is made up of several different panels, which means there is a chance it isn't dead straight along the top, which might cause a difference in width in the center here. If I give it a wiggle, you'll see that that is moving a lot. Whereas if I wiggle the back wall, which was just made out of one continuous section, you can see that that is barely moving at all. So the way I'm going to address this is I've got a leftover piece of 2x4 here. I'm going to put it at the end of the workshop because I know that the width here is correct. Mark out with a pencil line on both ends, and then I can move this over to the center of the workshop and screw it in on both sides. And that should be enough to hold the workshop at an equal width the entire way along. So we know that as we put the rafters in, everything should be nice and square. The timber that we're using for our rafters today is this 6x2. The reason that we're using this timber specifically is because the span tables clearly show that this will be strong enough for the area of roof that we have. If you're following the plans for this workshop specifically, then you can just simply use this size wood as well. If you are following your own design and you're wondering what size joists you need, then this is a great website that I'll have linked in the description. At the top, you can use this drop down and change the imposed load. And if you are just doing a basic flat roof structure, then you can keep it on this setting here. And depending on the strength of timber that you order, you can also change that. I'm using the C24 strength timber. Once you scroll down, you can clearly see that the timber I'll be using, which is 44 by 145 mil, allows me to have a total distance of the rafters of 2.859 meters, which is slightly above the distance that I need. And that allows for a 600 millimeter spacing between them. If, for example, the width of your workshop is 5 meters, then make sure to check that you are using the correct timber size before proceeding with your roof build.
Hello everyone, it's Jack from the future here, and what I've just shown you is slightly incorrect. So in the span tables, it does show that you can space your joists 600 millimeters apart, and that will give you enough strength for the roof, so when you're stood up there, you're not going to fall through it. However, what this fails to recognise is that 600 mil spacing isn't really going to be enough to support your plasterboard. This is a mistake I made, and I'd recommend that you actually space them 400 millimeters apart to avoid this problem. So you can see here, the plasterboard in my ceiling is actually cracked in quite a lot of areas, and that is because the spacing isn't right. And all of that has been updated in the plans that you will find in the description of this video.
Chris has just arrived and he's going to be cutting down all of the lengths of rafters. Whilst he's doing that, I'll be on the inside screwing them in, making sure that they are all the right distance apart. And as you can see from these plans, we required 12 rafters in total. All needed to be cut at a total distance of 3.56 meters. So starting us off, this is the first rafter in place. We have made sure that it sits just on this side of the wall. And again, that is to make sure that we have somewhere to fix the plasterboard to when it gets to that stage. We're also going to have a consistent overhang on the back and the sides of 120 mil. And you've got to remember that this overhang here still has another piece of 2x6 to go on there, and every single rafter is going to be screwed in from underneath using these 100 millimeter wood screws. Some of them will fall on a batten or an upright like this one, so in this case I'll have to go in at a slight angle. The two end rafters are now screwed into place, and before we actually screw in all of the rafters that fall in between, I am going to put a string line up. Then what we can do is push each of the rafters in between right up to that string line. And this string line is going to mean that as we push each of these rafters into place, they are going to be dead straight along the front and back as well. With those 12 rafters cut and the string line in place, the process of screwing them all in was very easy. You can also see here that we are using a spacer on either end of each of the rafters as we screw them in to make sure that we have an equal distance the entire way along. In between each of these rafters, we do need to put one of these noggins in. This is here for two reasons. One, it really does improve the strength of the roof, but it also makes sure that each of the rafters are at a perfect level upright. So now we just need to run through and put all of these in. As I was screwing a few of these noggins in, I was noticing that some of them were sticking up slightly from the height of the rafters in the roof, and that is not a good thing. So I decided that I would run each of these noggins through a table saw and take off about 10 mil from each of them just to avoid this problem happening. Now you can see here that where I have got the rafters above the door, which is where we've got this 6x2 braced above it, because the screws aren't long enough to go from underneath, I've just used these small L brackets, and that will be enough to hold these in place. And as you can see, all of the rest of the rafters are now in place. We're just going to run down the center and put the noggins in, and then we can start to fix these side rafters on. And just look how straight all of them rafters are. Lovely. The next thing we're doing is putting these little ladder bits on the outside, and that is to fix the end rafter too. So I've got Chris on the inside putting the screws in whilst I hold them on the outside. And with that laddering done, we are now ready to put the end rafters on the workshop, and we found that this was easiest with two people. We did make sure to hold a spirit level along the front of the rafters that we've already put into place, so we knew exactly where we needed to butt it up to make sure that they were all level at the front. After that, we did the exact same process on the front and back of the workshop, which meant that all of our rafters are now in place. As you can see, we now have all of the rafters in place, as well as all of the laddering and end pieces around the outside as well. Now, luckily, Chris did give me a hand to get 6 full boards of OSB sheeting on the roof before he left, and I am going to be cutting them up here to make this a lot easier on myself. So I am just going to go through each one of these, cut them down so they fall on a rafter, and then screw each one of them in. We've got the sheep out today. Something I've not spoke about yet is that you do need to make sure that the OSB boards are going lengthways across your rafters, and that just maximises the strength of them. You also want to make sure that as you put them in, you lay them like bricks, and that means that you're staggering the joints. I don't really know the reason why, but I know that's important to do. And I'm melting up here. With the roof ready and prepped, the last thing I'm going to do is temporarily install the rubber roofing, just to make sure it is watertight until next weekend when I will finish it off. And this weighs about 50 kilos, so try not to do it by yourself. Not too bad. So when installing this rubber roof, the first thing you need to make sure is that you have brushed over all of the OSB, just to get all of those loose pieces off. This is also the perfect time to triple check any of the screws you've put in on the top of the OSB and make sure that they are not sticking out of the top. Then once you're happy that you've swept it, get your rubber and open up the pack. And obviously be careful when you're opening it. You do not want to pierce it with a Stanley knife. So the first thing that you're going to want to do when you get this is unravel it to figure out which is the width and the length of your roofing. The way that Rubber for Roof package this is quite handy. So what I'm going to do before I unfold the other half is just make sure that both sides have an even overlap. So you can see that I've got about 150 mil overlap on all of the sides. So now I'm just going to fix it at the edges with some pieces of wood, and this will be enough to temporarily make it watertight until next weekend. And after all that, your roof structure is done and temporarily waterproof. At the moment, the rubber roof is only laid on the top. It's not actually been glued down. And before I can actually glue down the rubber roof, I do need to fit the fascia boards. And before I fit the fascia boards, the first thing that I'm going to need to do is fit the soffits on the overhang at the front. And this definitely isn't a one-person job, but this morning I am going to be on my own, so you can watch me struggle my way through it. This was my first time fitting soffit, and because I've decided to clad the outside of the workshop in a black composite cladding, I have opted for a matching black soffit to go on that overhang at the front. I went for the hollow option because it was a little bit cheaper, and here you can see me perfectly demonstrating why this is a two-person job. After a little bit of a struggle, you can see that I figured out how to use a clamp to hold this in the center, and then I could nail it into each of the rafters above using these poly pins, which held it in place. And because the length of the roof of the workshop that I'm building is over 5 meters, I did have to cut down a length using my miter saw. And honestly, I've got no idea if this will cut with a miter saw, but there's only one way to find out. I don't know if you can see that, but it's flaked off quite a bit there. And this is where I noticed that the miter saw actually did a really good job at cutting through the soffit board at the beginning when I was plunging it through. So I took another attempt and plunged it in several different locations throughout the width of the soffit board. And as you can see, that motion of going in from the top, I seem to have prevented that. So I think it's pushing it through this soffit that causes those cracks. After that was cut, I could then install it to the other end of the overhang. The next challenge that I needed to overcome was that I needed to cut down a full length of 5 meter soffit board on its width, which is a lot easier said than done. And to do this, I did ask for help off of Mrs. Sumeray Builds, who come along to hold the other end of the soffit board as it passed through the table saw. The height's less important than staying straight with this fence. That's the most, yeah, if it goes wonky, then I've wasted however much it's cost.
Yeah, like that's right.
To be honest, this whole thing was a little bit sketchy and I didn't enjoy doing it, but it did work and I was able to fit it nicely into place once it was done. In order to hide the joins between the two lengths of soffit board, I simply nailed in, using those poly pins, one of these joining caps. This is very straightforward to do. Just make sure that you leave an expansion gap between the two pieces of soffit board of 5mm and watch your fingers. Ow! So as you can see, all of these soffits have now been attached to this overhang, and this gap that you can see here has been left on purpose, and that is just to allow the cladding, once I put it on, to actually breathe. And the next thing I'm going to do is just put this fascia board along the front. You can see that I've got it clamped in the middle because I'm doing this on my own, and I've just realised I've got the wrong size fascia boards, but that's okay, I'll have to figure that out. Right. Now this piece of fascia board hasn't finished quite flush in line with the timber here, so I'm just going to use this multi-tool to cut off that edge. And I'm not worried about this being the neatest cut because there will be a bit of corner capping to cover this over. And I've cut the side piece down to length, but before I actually bang it up there, I do want to use this offcut here to take out a corner right there. Obviously, I did get the wrong fascia board. That is my mistake, and I would advise you not to do the same thing. I'm having to go around the edges of all of these and cut in a infill piece using a piece of batten and just nail it on. So now 3 out of the 4 sides of the roof have been covered in fascia board. I'm about to move on to do the back, and it is going to be quite difficult to film around there. The only real difference with the back, unlike the other sides that I've already done, is the back will be where the guttering sits, and this is where the drip edge trim will need to be fit on the edge. And to do this properly, you do need to fit an additional length of batten the entire way along. So the first thing that I'm doing is pre-drilling a load of holes into this length of batten. I'll also countersink them to make sure that these screws do not stick out from the wood once they're tightened up, and then I can fix it on that side of the workshop. I'm also going to pre-fix a lot of these screws in place just to make it even easier. So as you can see here, I'm now at the back of the workshop. Because I'm on my own, I'm just using a clamp to hold it at one end. Now, in order to finish off the corners of the fascia boards, you do need to get one of these, which is the corner end capping. I'm going to hook this underneath the corner, and then holding it on tight and using a hammer and one of those poly pins, just push it nice and tight on one side and hammer that in. And then once you've done that, just do the same thing on the other side. And then using a multi-tool, just cut off the excess. And that is a really nice, neat finish to all of the corners. And in order to do the joint capping, which is where 2 fascia boards meet, it is the exact same process. So you can hook this underneath the fascia board, and then holding it on tight, just put in a couple of pins either side of the center. And again, once you've done that, just cut the top off using the multi-tool. Before I get into the installation of the rubber roof, I did first want to talk you through the calculator that I used on the Rubber for Roofs website. I started off by selecting the square or rectangular roof shape, and I could then enter all of the measurements for the roof that I would need. It also allows you to select the type of edge that you need. So for the majority of mine, I needed these curb edges, and I also made sure to select the gutter trim for the back wall. You can then click next, and the calculator will ask you what you're fixing your roof to. do. It will also ask you to select between 3 different colors. I opted for the anthracite gray, but you can also get it in black and white to make sure that it matches the rest of your building. And lastly, it asks you if you want to include any of these optional extras. I actually didn't need any of these, so I left them at 0. You can then create your kit and the calculator will automatically add everything into your basket that you need. I actually opted for the 1.5mm premium membrane. However, both the Classic Bond 1.2 and the 1.5 are both BBA certified and compliant with building regulations. So it's entirely up to you which one that you go for. Also, don't forget to use discount code Sumeray at the checkout to receive 5% off your entire order. After burning my arms earlier today, I decided to wait until the late evening before finishing up this roof. And in case you missed it at the end of the last episode, I have already lifted the rubber onto the roof, swept the area to make sure it's clear of debris, and laid it flat to allow the rubber to relax to make fitting a lot easier. The next thing I'm going to do is peel back the rubber roof on the back here, and that is because the first thing I need to do before actually gluing down that rubber is put on part 1 of these drip trays, and this is all to do with the mechanism that Rubber for Roof send you when you actually buy one of these sets. And this part here that I'm putting on now goes underneath that edge of the rubber, so you won't see this. I'm just going to attach this with a few nails. So you can see here how I fixed that. It's just nailed onto this piece of batten. Just there like that. So all of the fascia boards are now on. Part 1 of the drip tray is on the back. This rubber roof has been relaxing for hours at this point, so you know that all of the creases are out. I've got all of the things that I'm going to need to actually do this glue up behind me. Notably, all of the glue, the tray to put the glue in, a tape measure, a pencil, a brush, and a straight edge. The first thing that you're going to need to do is roll back half of the rubber roof, and this is to give you access to the OSB underneath. And with that roll back, the next thing you're going to want to do is just give it one final sweep over, just to make sure that there's absolutely no dust or debris on here. And then with a tape measure, a pencil and a straight edge, just go around all of the edges that you've got exposed and mark out an area of 150mm or about 6 inches around the edge. And with that marked out, the next thing you want to do is actually pour all of your adhesive into the tray, being really careful obviously not to get it everywhere. And it is probably worth mentioning that the reason that I'm doing this late in the evening is because it should prevent the glue going off too quickly. And now it's just a case of applying this to the surface, and I'm actually going to do this in stages. I'm probably going to do about half of this, roll it out, and then do the last half, and that is just to make sure that it doesn't go off and that I've got enough time to actually get ahead of this. That's part of that glued, so now I'm going to roll this back out. And then using a brush, I'm just going over this just to get all of the bubbles out. And now I just need to do that to the remaining area. And if you're thinking, how does he know how much glue to put down? Well, the truth is I don't. This is my first time fitting one of these rubber roofs. I figured that if they sent me 6 litres of this adhesive, each half's going to need 3 litres, right? So I've used about half the tub to put this down. So I should be about right. Right, so same again, now that is glued out. Just roll it back, and same again, just with a brush. Just make sure you've got all of the bubbles out and that it is totally flat. Yesterday I glued down this rubber roof apart from the outer perimeter, which was the 150mm around all of the edges. Now all of this glue is dry, I'm going to go around the outer perimeter where I've marked out that 150mm around the entire edge, and I'm going to be using this bonding adhesive. Now the way this works is slightly different from the adhesive that I used for the majority of the roof, in that this is a glue that you use on the wood as well as the membrane. I'm going to apply an even coat on both of these, and after I've put this on, I'm going to leave it about 2 to 3 minutes to tack off, which basically means it should be dry to the touch before sealing it down and applying pressure to the top of that rubber. I'm going to dip my roller in here and work along this edge. And it's fair to say on a sunny day like today, this isn't going to take very long to tack off. So a nice sunny day, this has already started to tack off. So I am going to fold this over now. And using this little roller thing, just going to make sure I apply a lot of pressure to this edge. So now I'm just going to work my way around the other 3 edges and do the exact same process. And now all of those edges have been bonded down. I'm going to start with the back edge and just fix on the second part of this gutter trim. Now this should nicely push into that trim that sits underneath the rubber. So it forms one smooth edge along this edge here. When you've got that about where it needs to be, just going to fix it in with these poly nails. And when I'm putting these in, I'm making sure not to put them right the way in. Just because if you do hammer them right the way in and then you go to take off that protection layer, you'll find a little bit of that layer gets stuck underneath the nail. So you're better off just hammer them in, sticking out about 10 mil or so, then peel off your protection and then welt them in. And once that's all in, it should look nice and butted up just like that. And anywhere you've got a join like this one, you get one of these join clips. And the way these work is they just hook over both edges. They're pretty tricky to do with one hand, so I've had to do it off camera, but you hook it from underneath and then push the top in over the top. And then you get quite a nice, neat finish where 2 of these join. And before I can put these edge trims on, I am going to need to cut off the overhang here to about 50 mil. And you haven't got to be too accurate with this. You can just sort of guesstimate. And I'm just checking that I've cut enough off by holding this in place and making sure that none of that rubber is sticking out underneath this, which it's not. So I can now peel off this piece of tape that sits just on top of this foam here, and then butting it up nicely into that corner. I'm not worried about how it looks for now with the rubber. Just gonna make sure it sits flush on that end. And I'm pushing it down ever so slightly, applying a bit of pressure on that foam before putting my first nail in. And again, I'm not driving it all the way home, getting a few in just to hold it in place at first. And as I put the nails in, before I drive them all the way home, I'm going to peel off that protection and then finish them right in. And that is the process for putting this on. So I'm just going to make my way around the edges and finish this off. I'll be using the multi-tool to cut down the longer lengths to the little bits that I need. And you do just want to make sure that you're leaving a little bit of a gap. So I'm leaving about 3 or 4 mil in between these 2 pieces here, and that's just to allow for expansion. Now the way I'm folding over the corners, sort of like this, and then I'll put the trim over that and that will hold that in place and prevent it getting wet. And again with these caps, they just hook underneath and you push them over. And with these corners here, you just want to pop out these bits and then these nicely sit on top of there, just like so. This was my first time installing a rubber roof, or any roof for that matter, but I'm really happy with how it turned out. I think it gives a really professional finish to the roof, and it's got me really excited to finish the cladding later on in the month. After reviewing the prices of a brand new French door online, you could expect to pay anywhere from the region of about £1,000 to £2,000. And if you want those fancy bifold doors, then you could be looking upwards of about £4,000 or £5,000. I didn't want to pay that, so I spent quite a lot of time looking on Facebook Marketplace and Gumtree until I found this second-hand French door, which comes with these nice rolling blinds as well, which I think is an absolute bargain. I also know someone that installs windows as their day job, and they were able to keep an eye out for me and found this second-hand window that I plan on installing. The second-hand window is not as good as the door that I've bought, but to be honest, I don't actually plan on opening this window that often. This is really just at that end of the workshop just to let light in. Okay, so the first thing I'm doing is cutting down this windowsill to the width of the window. After cutting down that windowsill, I did just check that it was the right width by putting it in the hole in that sidewall there. I then used some 50mm screws to attach the windowsill to the bottom of the window from the underside. So before you fit any window, you do just want to put a spirit level on it and make sure that the bubble is perfectly in the center, which this is, so that's good. And because the bottom of the windowsill was level and the sill has now been attached, we could move the window into place. We started off by fixing the windowsill on one side using one screw at the bottom. And now that we've got that one screw in at the bottom on one of the windows, I'm just using a spirit level just to make sure that we are level sort of that way before we fix in the top on this side. And that there is perfect. With that side leveled up, we then secured it in place with another screw at the top. So now we've got that one side fixed in, you can see that we've got a bit of a gap there. So before we put these screws in, we do just need to fit some packers behind it. You can see that we've got this packer just behind where this screw is going. Got my dad outside checking it's level, and then we'll just bang that in. The trick is with the other side, you don't want to screw it in so much that it pulls the PVC out. You don't want it pinching it out, so you want to screw it in just enough. And with the window frame fully secured, we could now move the glass back in and secure it in place using the beading. And some people might be put off by using second-hand windows. Me, I'm not that bothered, and it's got the added benefit of we are recycling here. If we didn't use this, then this would just end up in landfill. So, you know, good for the planet, which is nice. I did also want to show just that I'm finishing the actual window level with where the OSB in this felt is. At the moment, that might seem a bit odd because you wouldn't usually have it level. You'd usually have it set in a bit, but you do have to remember that we're going to have 50 mil of batten and then the cladding on here. So by the time we've done that, the actual width of the wall will be sticking out a bit further than that window, which is why it's finishing flush right now. So as you can see, this window is now in, but for reasons that I haven't figured out yet, it doesn't actually let me shut it. I'll show you. Keeps getting stuck there. For a free window, I can hardly complain, but I am going to take a little visit down to Screwfix. I've seen the replacement hinges there being sold for just over £12, and I'm hoping that if I replace them, then that will actually solve the problem and the window will be able to shut. Luckily, those hinges were very straightforward to change. We used the old ones as a reference point just to make sure that we were putting them in the right way round. And with those no hinges in, this is now opening and shutting lovely. And now that this window's in, you can see quite clearly at the top, there's a huge gap. Now, it's normal to have gaps at the sides of your windows when you're installing it. In fact, you want that because you can pack it out. But that gap up there is definitely too big to just fill with expanding foam. So I'm going to use the table saw and an offcut of wood just to try and cut a piece of 2x4 to actually get in there. And I'll fix it in with some screws from this angle. And then whatever gap is remaining after that, I can fill with expanding foam. And I need a piece that is 10 mil on one side and then 40 mil on the other side. So the first thing I'm doing is just cutting down a strip of this OSB board. So now I've cut this OSB and I know it's parallel. This is a straight cut and I've got the right length bit here. So I'm going to mark 10 mil there and just under 40 mil on this end. So that's now been fixed to that piece of wood using just a couple of nails. You don't want to go too mad because it will get stuck. And now I should be able to run that through there. Because I cut two of these angled lengths separately, I did need to glue and clamp them together. And I waited till the next day to finish this off. And now that glue has gone off, I should be able to bang this into the gap here, just using a hammer. I'll need to make sure that I don't bang it in too far. It wants to finish just level with where the current 2x4 is. I can then just pre-drill just a few holes and fix that end just using a few 50 mil wood screws. And that is going to create a really nice tight seal around all of here. And then using that same method, I've just cut a bit of OSB that I'll just tuck under here as well, just to bring the thickness out above this window. And then I'm going to hammer that in just using a couple of nails. And using that multi-tool, I'm just going to cut away these parts of the spacers that I've used at the edge of the window and the doors. And then I'll just grab a Stanley knife and cut off the overlapping felt here as well. Now this window is pretty much bang on for what I need. The only thing that I am going to replace is this handle. It is a bit battered, and I think for the sake of like £6 to buy a new handle, it's going to be well worth replacing. But that is exactly what I was looking for, so I'm happy with that. Before we move on to the doors, I did just want to show you the latest grass update from episode 4. You can see that it is coming through very well. This has been about 2 months since I put that seed down, and I'm overall really impressed with it. And if you're wondering what that lawnmower is in the background, then I'll be doing a video on that in a couple of weeks. So now we're moving on to the door, but whoever has taken out this old windowsill didn't do a particularly neat job at this edge. So I'm going to take the very minimal cut off of this with the miter saw, just to make sure we've got a neat edge on either side. So again, I'm just pre-drilling this windowsill from underneath so I can fix it to this door. And you do just want to make sure when you're putting these screws in from underneath that they don't penetrate through the bottom here. So you can see that those 50mm screws have landed perfect and they're not sticking out. So now that this door is in place, the first thing that we want to do is just make sure that the side that we're going to screw in first is level. And what I'm doing is I've got these 80mm wood screws, and then on the back of them I've just got a little washer, just because I don't want them to push through the actual plastic. So we're going to get one in at the top, and then we'll check the level before putting the rest in. So this is just how the screws are going in. So you can see I've just got a little washer behind that wood screw, and that's just enough just to make sure that that screw doesn't actually pull straight through the plastic. And we'll just do that for every single screw. So the way these packers work is you're putting them in behind the PVC of the frame here, but the way you want to line your screws up is that they actually land in the middle here, and that's just to make sure that you've got equal pressure either side of the screw. So we've put this in where the screw is going to be landing, and then we can put that in. And this door frame also had a hole at the top, so we're using that as justification to put in another screw at the top here. We're just again putting a packer in, and then we'll put a screw up there. Level there. Level there. That should mean that now we check the top, we are level there too. And in the bottom of this door frame, there are some holes. I don't think you would usually drill it at the bottom, but it seems to make more sense to me to put a screw in it if there is a hole. So we're going to just drill this through with an SDS drill. And in theory, the door should just slot in lovely now. And then the very last thing I'm going to do is using some expanding foam. I'm just going to fill in all of the gaps around the edges of the window and the door. And this is just to make sure that they are absolutely airtight. And I'm not worried about it leaking out for now because I'll be able to get that off once it's gone hard. So as you can see, I've gone around all of those gaps and just put the expanding foam in on both the window as well as the door. And I've gone from the inside as well as the outside. And with that expanding foam in place and peeled off, the door and window are now ready to be used. After a lot of research looking into different types of cladding, I have decided that I'm going to be using this plastic composite cladding. The one I've gone for is black with a wood effect grain in it.
Nice.
When comparing the price of this composite cladding against your more traditional timber cladding, this does work out a lot more expensive. Roughly speaking, it is going to be about twice as much once everything is fully done. However, when I compared the benefits of this over timber, I made the decision to go with this, and that is mainly because I'm never going to need to treat it with any sort of wood preserver or paint ever again. And I have decided that I'm going to fit this cladding vertically along the front and two side walls of all of the workshop. However, before I start to attach that cladding, there are a few preparation steps that I must take. Before I put any batten on the walls this morning, I am just going to go around the top and the bottom of all of those gaps and put this up. This is insect mesh. This is important because it's going to prevent insects treating the cladding on your workshop as their hotel. It will also stop things like rodents and most importantly things like bees making a nest in there. And the way I'm doing this here is I am holding it in the gap that I left in the soffit. Now that that insect mesh is in place, the next thing I'm going to do is cut down all of the vertical lengths of batten to the correct length using the miter saw. And now those battens are cut, essentially what I need to do is fix each of them to the outer walls. And I do want to make sure that I'm lining them up with the internal uprights. And the way I've done that is marked a piece of batten on the inside of the workshop with where all of those uprights fall, and then transferred that to the outside onto the felt using a piece of chalk. And because this is the first layer of battens, there's actually going to be another layer going vertically across these as well. I am only going to be nailing in these. And the reason for that is because when I put that second layer on, I'll be using 100mm screws that will be enough to go through both of these into the studs behind them. So this will save quite a lot of time with pre-drilling and getting the screws in that initial layer, and you'll also save a lot of screws. So now all of the vertical battens have been fixed to the wall, it is time to do the horizontal battens. The reason that it's important to have 2 layers of batten, the vertical battens that you can see here, and that allows air from the bottom of the workshop to go up underneath the panelling and circulate within the joists of your roof. And these vertical battens would be absolutely fine if you were laying your cladding horizontally. But because I'm laying my cladding vertically, I then need to put on a second layer of horizontal battens like this, so that when it comes to cladding, I have somewhere to actually fix that cladding at several points, like I'm showing you now. And I don't know if you can see this, but I've got a little screw just sticking out down there that is going to allow me to hook that on at one end. And I will be putting one of those screws into every single place that that vertical batten runs. And these battens do actually split quite easy, so I recommend pre-drilling every single hole. And for every single horizontal piece, I'm going to space them apart 600mm. And before I put this last horizontal batten in, I am just going along the bottoms here and stapling the insect mesh to the first battens we put on. And that's just going to keep it out of the way and allow the insect mesh to keep the creepy crawlies out. So now all of those battens are actually up, but I've just done it for the front wall. And I can tell you that this is taking a whole lot longer than I thought. This front wall, to get it just battened out, has taken me the best part of 3 hours. And because this is much of the same process throughout the entire thing, I am just going to skip ahead to when all of the walls have been battened out. But on screen now, you can see a series of photos that show exactly how I did the batten on every single one of the walls, including around the windows, which you can use as a reference point in case you need to do a wall that is similar. So you can see on every single corner, I've put in an extra piece, and that's just to make sure that the corner sections have something to butt up against when they're in. On the bottom of every single wall and at the top, I've got a double batten, and that's just to make sure that I've got room for the piece at the top that covers the cladding, as well as enough room to actually fix the cladding onto some batten at the top. Around the door, I've also double battened around the entire edge, and I've done the same thing for the window. So I've double battened around the window, and I've left about a 20mm gap underneath the window, and that is just to allow air to get through up here and actually circulate through the bottom of the timber underneath the window as well. And at the back of the workshop, it is a little bit harder to film, but I've only got 4 pieces of batten going across. And the reason for that is I'm going to be using the metal cladding down here, which is a lot more rigid, so there's not as much need to have as many fixing points. And for those that are wondering if 100mm wood screws going through both of the battens is strong enough, I'm Spider-Man! They're strong. Now all of the prep work is finally done. The first thing I need to do before actually putting the cladding on the walls is prepare the corners and the edges, and that's just for the actual cladding to slot into. I have just cut down this first corner piece on my miter saw, and I am going to be fixing it to this corner using some 35mm, 3.5mm screws. And apparently there is no need to pre-drill this plastic, so hopefully it doesn't actually split. And that's going to hold that in place lovely. And the way that these work is you put the first part of the corners in, then you do your cladding, and then you get the second part of the corners, and this clicks into place and holds it just like that. And if you ever need to take it off, it's just a case of popping this out like that. So quite a neat little solution there. Now, once those corners are in, the next thing you need to do is fit this, I don't even know what it's called, the top and the bottom bit. I have used part 2 of the corners. I've just used a bit of scrap and fixed them at the top here, just so I know exactly where this needs to butt up to. And unfortunately, this is only 3 meters long, and I need it to be about 3.1 meters. So I will have to cut a little scrap piece for the end. So I'm going to fix this just here using those same 35mm screws. And we do have to fit the exact same piece along the bottom of the walls as well. The only difference is being at the bottom, the cladding is going to fall into this. So there is a chance that this over time will collect water. So the manufacturer does recommend drilling in a 10mm hole every 100mm, along the entire length of every piece of this that goes at the bottom. I've drilled in all of my drainage holes along the bottom here, and because I know each of these battens is perfectly level, all I'm going to do is actually butt this up along the bottom of that batten and then fix it in with those same screws. This side wall now has both of the corners as well as the bottom and the top pieces in place. So it is finally ready to actually start cutting the cladding and screwing it in place. The only thing that I do need to bear in mind about both of these side walls is that this is where the roof is slightly slanted. So I don't want to go and cut every single piece of cladding at the same length, because I'll probably end up having gaps at this end. So what I'm going to do is cut a couple of them and then keep measuring just to make sure that I'm adjusting that length accordingly as I go along. And you do want to make sure when you cut this that you're not cutting it absolutely dead on the gap that you've got. You want to actually leave yourself 5mm for expansion on either end. So I am making sure just to cut it ever so slightly shorter. And now I've got this first piece of cladding roughly in place. I'm just going to use a spirit level. I'm hoping that this is level. And it is. Perfect. And same again, just using some short corrosive resistant screws, I'm going to drill it at every single place that a batten is running across this side of the workshop. And the aim here is to not absolutely welt the screws in so far that you actually split the plastic. You want it in just enough that this isn't going to move anywhere. And if I've done that correctly, this piece should now just slot in next to it. Because I've put in the bottom, you sort of need to bend it and then lift this because it is quite tight. Lift this top bit here, just up a bit. Now get it under there. And then I can batt this in this way. And it does naturally stop when you've got that correct overlap. Again, I'm going to check every single one with a spirit level. Now, as you can imagine, there is quite a lot of cladding to cut and then fix in and not a lot to talk about. So I think it's time to cue the music. Now, for anyone wondering what I'm going to do at this point, because a full width of that cladding isn't actually going to fit there, it's going to need to be cut down, I have no idea. Right, and now with that cut on the table saw, hopefully this will just slot into here. And because I've cut off the piece of the cladding that you would use to actually fix this to the batten, I am just going to drill a few holes. And now I'm just going to fit on this corner piece just to neaten up this edge. Now that that side wall is done, I've moved on to the front wall. And it occurred to me as I was putting this beading on that this bit here is going to be quite difficult to finish because there's a cut that isn't cut at the top. Let me just get these few pieces in and then I'll show you what I mean. Just like that. And this is why it's going to be difficult, because this piece here, if I use this scrap piece as an example, isn't going to allow me to slot it into this J-trim here and then feed it behind this piece of cladding here. So I'm going to have to cut this down on my table saw widthways whilst making sure to not cut the very top section that does need to fit behind this top piece of J-trim above the door. I made a mark just on the inside of that piece of J-trim so I know where I'm going to cut it. So I am just going to practice on this piece first. With that practice piece cut, I'm hoping that I can push this in here and then also get it back there, and I can. So I can cut it at that width, so now I just need to work out the height. So I've made a small incision on the miter saw just below where this piece doesn't need to be cut off. So then I'm going to attempt to use my table saw to take off just this bottom section here. Now I need to go see if that fits. This is hard. That has taken so long to get in. I managed to mess up this cut twice before actually cutting it on the third time, so This took a long time and it was expensive. As you can see here, I have started on the window wall, so you can see how I've put the trims on here. I've got the main one going along the top and the bottom, and then I've got one at the side of this window and underneath it for now. I have then used a combination of the table saw and the miter saw to cut out the front top corner of this long piece. And what I'm hoping is that this will actually nicely fit into here, although I'm sure it's going to give me some challenges. So let's see how we get on. So you can see that I've got that piece tucked in on the bottom J trim. And then here it's going sort of into this piece and then on this piece at the side. And then it goes all the way up there and then finishes off nicely, just resting in that top piece of J trim. Now I just need to fill in the shorter pieces underneath the window and see how I end up on this end. Interestingly, because these are much shorter lengths, they're actually a lot harder to bend into these J trims, but you can just get it by just applying a bit of force. I do love how those corner pieces finish off the edge. It looks really good. Okay, so this is the black architrave that I've got to put around the window and the door. And the way I'm going to fit this is first just put a little bead of black silicone on the back side of it. And then I'm going to push this up into place. Being really careful not to get silicone everywhere. There we go. And just for good measure, I am also going to bang in a few of these poly pin nails. One slight oversight I had when putting the window in, or actually the structure for the window, is it's very close to the top of this wall. And what that means is I've not left myself enough room to get in two J trims to actually fit nicely. So I'm going to have to think my way around this problem because I don't think a J trim is the right solution. So what I'm going to do is cut off this piece here that's sticking out from this cladding offcut that I've made, and then actually fill it back in using one piece of wood. And that should prevent it rocking in that top J trim. So now I've got that piece of wood and I've got this piece of cladding cut down, and that should make it stick out enough so the top of that windowsill looks decent. And that has worked really nicely. So the last thing that I need to do is fit the metal sheeting on the back of the workshop. Now I got this sheeting that you can see here from a company called Cladco. It was the only place that I could find that was reasonably priced. However, their delivery charge did make my eyes water just a little bit. In total, I needed 6 of these panels to cover the back of the workshop, which meant one of them did need to be cut down. And to do that, I just used this Evolution track saw with their multi-material cutting blade attached.
How does it go, Daddy?
How does it go?
Yeah.
It's going to spin. It's going to go quite fast, so I need you to stand back there, all right?
Now, the way that you actually fix these metal sheets to the batten behind it is using these fixing bolts here. You want to start off by just pre-drilling a hole in the metal where you're going to fix that bolt. Then you can hold that bolt up there and using an impact driver, just drive it home. And the last thing you want to do is just using one of these coloured caps, pop that over the top. That's going to help keep it waterproof, but more importantly, it is just going to make it look a lot nicer. Where the two pieces of metal cladding actually overlap, it's the exact same process. So you just, again, just drill a hole between the two and using a slightly shorter stitcher bolt this time, just put that between them. And then again, just cover that over using one of those same caps. And as you can see, they finish them off really nicely. And some of you might be wondering why I haven't used the composite cladding on the back of the workshop. And the reason for that is this metal cladding is actually a lot cheaper and a lot simpler to install. I'm just going to do you a favour and fast forward through this section of the video where I start to talk about building regulations. If you haven't seen it already, then episode 2 in this series goes deep into detail, and I will make sure to link it right here. And with that, I can finally say that the outside of the workshop is completely done. It can't be understated enough. This stage of the project has been the most time consuming and the most costly out of the entire workshop build. And yes, mistakes were made along the way, but in the end, I am over the moon with how this workshop looks. And a little disclaimer going into this video, even though I have wired up several sockets and lights before, I do not want to be on the hook for anyone that decides to electrocute themselves. And therefore this video is intended to be used alongside a fully qualified electrician. And before we can put any of the electrics in on the inside, we are first going to need to hook up the electric from my cabin over there to the workshop. And in order to do that, we need to bury some armoured cable. So the first thing we're doing is actually going to be putting down some polythene to put all of the soil on as we're digging it out. Then we'll dig out the trench, lay the cable in, and, well, we'll just show you. Yeah, you get in. You background dig. Look busy. The trench is now pretty much done. We are just going around and making sure that we are at the correct depth the entire run. And that is just to make sure that the cable isn't going to be pierced by anything that I put through the lawn in the future. I'm not going to lie, this has probably been the hardest step in terms of effort since we actually put that concrete base in all those months ago. So if you are digging this yourself and you're not using a digger, then mentally prepare yourself. Also, if you are watching this entire series through, then one top tip I would have for you is get this dug out when you've got the digger there digging out the base. You're going to save loads of time and you're going to save loads of effort. And now it's time to lay that cable in. The cable that we're putting in the ground is armoured, and because of that you don't actually need to put it in any sort of conduit. But because I have quite a lot of leftover guttering, what I'm going to do is cut this in half on my table saw widthways and then use this just to put over the top of that armoured cable, just for that extra layer of protection. And whilst I'm here and I've got the trench dug, I figured I may as well bury this as well. And this is armoured Cat 5 cable. So these are both going to go side by side next to each other in the same trench. I figured for, I think this was about £50 to buy this cable. I may as well put it in to prevent me redigging this trench in the future. So right here is where the cable will be connecting into the workshop. It needs to connect in 450 mil above what is the ground levels. That's 600 mil there. So I've got a little bit to play with for the electrician. So we know that we can bury that in there. And then as it's covered, I'm actually going to just push in a load of soil. And then we also are going to make sure that before we put in all of that remaining soil, we do stamp it in with our feet just to make sure it's nice and compact. And putting all of that soil and grass on polythene meant that we could just lift it up and the majority of it just fell right back into the trench. It ain't bad. It ain't bad, is it? As you can see, all of the grass has now been covered over on the trench that we've dug. It is sticking out the ground just a little bit. So right now it does look a little bit unsightly, but I'm hoping that in a few days' time that will all finish in lovely. Now the electric cable runs from the fuse box to the workshop. We can move on to doing the electrics on the inside. One thing that I've been very keen to do is actually give you guys a tour on the inside of the workshop. Now over here next to the door, I'm probably going to have some sort of small French cleat wall. And this is also where I plan to push up that rolling workbench once I've built it. Behind me is the side wall that has no window, and this is going to serve as the new backdrop for a lot of my videos. And because of this, I'm going to have a huge French cleat wall where I can hang all of my latest and greatest tools, and I'm not going to have any cupboards along the bottom. Now over here is the 5-meter long stretch of back wall. And along all of this side, I want to have a series of wall units and then underneath a counter with storage below it. And this is that entire wall, just so you get an idea for the space that I'm working with. And finally, behind me is the window wall, and this is where I plan to have a desk below the window, as well as some shelves or maybe a wall unit on either side of that window. And because I have a rough idea of how I want the layout of this workshop to look once everything is done, I know exactly where I want to put my plug sockets. Now, if you've never installed a socket before, I'm going to give you a very quick crash course in how to do the first fix. This piece of wood here is going to represent our wall. Now for my workshop, I've decided to use these metal back boxes. You can also do a similar method using the dry lining back boxes, but personally, I'm not the biggest fan of those. In order to do this with back boxes, you would then need to fix these to the wall using some wood screws. Then you want to grab yourself something long and pointy and a hammer and knock out the 2 pieces of metal on the top of each of them. And this is going to give you somewhere to feed in your cable into the actual center of these back boxes. Now the cable thickness that you will use is typically going to be 2.5 mil for sockets. However, I do recommend that you speak to an electrician to confirm your exact requirements depending on what you need. A good example of this is the fact that I am going to be setting up my workshop with one of these stop buttons, which will automatically cancel all of the power to every single socket. And because I needed that, I did actually need to install all of my sockets with 4 mil twin and earth cable. And once you've fed in your cables, you are then ready to insulate and plasterboard. Now, all of that is called the first fix. It is only after that that you are ready to do the second fix, which means you can finally put your socket fronts on. And after a lot of consideration, I have finally settled on putting 15 double plug sockets around the entire edge of the workshop, evenly spaced out as much as I can get them. Now, I did have a lot of friends and family try and talk me out of this, saying that it is probably quite excessive.
It's a little excessive, don't you think?
I don't think so.
And whilst I don't disagree with them, I figured that for the price of putting in one of these sockets at this stage, which roughly works out at about £7 or £8, I won't regret putting in too many, whereas I may find myself in the future regretting not putting in enough. And before I can put any of the back boxes in on the wall, I am preparing by firstly measuring out the exact height that I want each of these sockets to be and putting a pencil line on either side of the timbers. I've cut down this remaining 2x4 from when I did the walls to the correct width, so this should bang nicely in between these two studs here. And because of the actual depth of each of these back boxes, you do need to make sure that you have your piece of wood set in enough so that by the time that you plasterboard, it finishes level with the front of this back box. Letting this back box stick out about 10mm is perfect. And to keep this consistent, what I found is an offcut of oak that I have been putting behind this piece of wood, which then allows me to take a rubber mallet and hammer it to a consistent depth on both sides. And because I know that is in the right place, I'm just going to fix it in place using some 70mm wood screws on either side. Now those pieces of timber are in place, I can fit the back boxes to them. This is one of those jobs that is a lot easier to do if you have a laser level like I have here. So you can see here that I've got the laser level set up and the line here is just touching the bottom of this metal back box. So I know that that one is perfect. And the idea is that I will not move that laser, and I will go around the entire perimeter and just make sure that that laser line falls on every single one. However, if you don't, you can still fit these just using a spirit level like I'm showing. And even though I was using a laser level, I did still get out a small spirit level just to make sure that each individual back box was level with itself. After all of those were in place, I went round and popped out the top two pieces of metal in each of the back boxes and fitted in a rubber grommet that will prevent the cable from snagging when I put them in later on. I have also decided to put one double plug socket in the ceiling, and that is just there in case I want to connect some lights whilst I'm filming a video, or I might want to set up an extractor fan and avoid having trailing cables going along one side. After the back boxes were installed, I could go round and install all of the cable. So in order to feed these cables through the uprights here, I am using a 12mm drill bit, and I'm just drilling a very small hole at the back of these timbers. And the benefit of doing these holes for the cables so far back is that when it comes to plasterboarding, even if I use quite a long screw, like a 50mm screw, there's no way that I'm going to hit that cable once it's been fed through there. This also meant that the cable would poke through just behind those pieces of timber that I put in for the back boxes to sit against, which made feeding them into the back boxes themselves a lot easier. As you can see here, I've now pulled this cable through to where it's going and I've pushed it through the grommet. Now, what most people would usually do here is grab one of these cable clips, put it over the top and then hammer that in. However, what I would rather have is a totally flat surface so that when it comes to putting the insulation board in here, I don't have to notch a bit out. So what I'm doing is grabbing a 19mm drill bit and then drilling out this top piece of wood here. And as you can see, that has created a lovely gap for my cable to sit in and be tucked in. And now all of these sockets are in. You can see that this is where up here is where I'm going to have my fuse box. I've got a cable starting here going from where the fuse box will be. It runs to the first socket. That's going to go around the entire room. You can see here, it's going into all 15 of these sockets. Ignore the insulation. That's for the next video. All the way around underneath the window here. And it ends down in this socket right down here. I also took this opportunity to put an external socket on either side of the workshop, which was a lot easier said than done. Look at us taking the cladding off, aren't we mental? So this is the hole that I've drilled from the inside at 450 mil. And the reason that I've drilled this in is I want to have one of these external sockets mounted on the outside. Now, in order to do that, what I'm going to need to first do is mount this base plate here. And I didn't want to fix this directly to the cladding. So what I need to do is put in some stronger timber behind where this is going to be, so I have somewhere strong enough to actually fix these screws that I will need to mount this. Then I could reinstall the cladding that I had previously removed, drilled a hole so the cable could be poked through, and fit the back box for the external sockets, making sure to pre-drill all of the holes so I didn't split the cladding. Then I wired it up and screwed the front of this socket on. With all of my sockets prepared for insulation and plasterboarding, I could now move on to the lights. And starting off, I decided that I was going to put 5 downlights in the overhang on the front of the workshop. So for each of the downlights, you can see that I've got a little bit of green masking tape in every place that I want to drill out the hole. And in order to drill these out, I'll be using this bit here. This is a 73mm bit, and I have tested it on an offcut of OSB, just to make sure that the lights fit well, and they do. And I don't think it's just me, but I always find stuff like this really nerve-wracking because any slight mistake means redoing an awful lot of work. So I'm going to take my time and hopefully get every single one of these right. Turns out this is a really messy job. And now that those holes are drilled in the overhang, I can wire it up using this 1.5mm twin and earth cable. And now I've got all of my cables fed through for these downlights. I'm going to be installing these. These are lap downlights that I bought from Screwfix. They were about £7 each, and I've got them in my bathroom and in my kitchen, so I know that these are going to do a good job. And the way that these work is you pop out these little pieces of plastic here just by pinching them at the bottom. You've got the letter L and N to indicate which is the live and neutral. You can then slide in your 2 cables and push them in firmly. There we go. I'm just sliding a little bit of earth sleeving over the earth cable as well. After speaking to my electrician, I did have to go back to each one of these spotlights and connect each of the earths together using these Wago clips. And then you finish this off by pushing on those pieces of plastic. And now that's done, you can fold up these little side latches here, push it into the hole at an angle so it all fits through, and then sort of with a bit of force, push that up into place. Just like that. Because they're going along those straight lines of the soffit, they are all in a perfect straight line. And it's hard to pick this up on camera, but I've made sure that there's an equal gap of 118 centimeters in between each of those spotlights. When it comes to calculating how many lights you'll need in your workshop, there are calculators online that you can use in order to work out the total amount of lumens that they recommend. I'll link the one that I used in the description below. After doing the calculations, it told me that I would need to have a total of 3,200 lumens in order to have a high intensity of light. And I do want the workshop to be quite bright because the things I'll be doing in there will require a lot of visibility. These spotlights that I got from Screwfix are each 420 lumens each, and I'm going to be putting 10 of them in 2 rows of 5 on the inside of the workshop, which will put me well above the recommended lumens that I needed. So I'm going to have 1 row of 4 spotlights running down this side of the workshop, and then a symmetrical 4 running down this side of the workshop. Using a tape measure and a pen, I'm going to mark up 70 centimeters away from the side of the wall on both ends, and then using a laser level, I will then make my marks along the entire row, making sure that they are positioned in the correct place. And I am being careful to remember that I still need to put 100mm of insulation on the bottom of these joists here. So what that means is when I actually drill the hole to feed the cables through, I want to go above that insulation. So I want to be drilling that hole to feed the cable through right at the top here, so that when I put the insulation in, it doesn't interfere with that. I do also want to be very careful that when I'm drilling this hole, I don't go too close to this OSB board at the top. It is quite thick and it's unlikely, but you do just want to make sure that you avoid going through the roof, because obviously then you'll have a hole in your roof, and that's not a good thing. Oh, and I nearly forgot to say, I'm just using a normal 10mm drill bit to actually drill these holes. And the reason for that is the cable that you use for lighting is actually really thin. So that is actually plenty to get it through to the other side of the joist. So as you can see, every single place where I want one of those internal spotlights, I have put this 1.5mm twin and earth cable, and I've left about 500mm dangling down from the ceiling. And that is all of the cables now in the ceiling, ready for the electrician to come later this week to check everything over. Now, the insulation that I'm going to be using on both the ceiling and all of the walls is this. This is Celotex PIR board. It is quite a bit more expensive than some of the other options, especially rock wool. So if you are trying to save a little bit of money and you're not bothered about having slightly less efficient insulation, then you can choose rock wool instead. So firstly, a bit of an oversight that I made was these noggins. I do need to make sure that once the insulation is in, that there is ventilation above, and these noggins are going to prevent that. Now I've got a couple of options. One is I can drill several holes along the top here to encourage that ventilation, or the other, and arguably I think the best way to do this, would be to actually remove as many of these noggins as possible and cut them down on my table saw so there is one clear span of ventilation throughout the entire way. So now you can see that I've got those noggins back up, and they do have an air gap above them of about 50mm. The only ones I couldn't get out were these ones at the end because they are screwed in from an inaccessible side. So in that case, I have just drilled 3 fairly big holes in that area. And you can see this one piece of insulation that I've got up just as an example means that now that that piece of noggin has been cut down, that above it there is just ventilation. So there's absolutely nothing getting in the way of full ventilation above this piece of insulation. Now, the easiest method I have found to actually cut this is by using my track saw. So the steps that I'm going through to actually do this is first marking up the area where I want to cut it. I'll just stab my tape measure in that end as a mark. I'll do the same thing at the other end. I will then position my track on those 2 marks. I'm then going to grab my track saw. I've got it to the deepest it will go, which isn't actually enough to cut all the way through it, but that's okay. And then I'll make this cut. And I nearly forgot to say, you should absolutely have a dust mask on when you're cutting this stuff. This is not the sort of stuff that you want to end up in your lungs. Here's the one I recommend. I'll have in the link in the description below. Then once you've made that initial cut, move the track out of the way, and with a handsaw, just make your way across and finish this off. And then don't throw bits like this away. You never know if you're going to need them. So just keep them to one side for now. If you're not lucky enough to have a track saw, then you can use a piece of wood and just a normal handsaw. And the main aim here is to make sure that this saw stays butted up nicely against this piece of wood. So as you're cutting it, you know that you're going in at a 90-degree angle. You can then take your piece of insulation and tuck it in on one side. And hopefully I've got a nice tight fit here. And you can see that that is now fully flush with all of the joists that surround it. I did also want to show you what I'm doing for the light. So here you can see I've got the cable hanging down for the spotlights, and I've already cut myself the piece that's going to fit in here. So I'm just going to test the fit. And then just going to use a Sharpie just to mark out the area. So I know that I'm 70mm off this joist here. Is that better? So I'm there. I'll then take this down. Okay, so now I'm outside, and this is the mark where I know that that spotlight cable needs to come through. I've got here a very large fit that I'm going to drill through, but as you can tell, it won't drill all the way through. So I'm going to mark that up and then drill. Then I've got another drill with just a 12mm bit in there, and the aim with this one is I'm drilling all of the way through. There we go. I can then flip it upside down, and using that same bit, just like that. I can then punch it, and you can see that I've left with this very spherical cake, and I'm not done with this yet. So using just a normal handsaw, I'm going to chop this in half widthways. I'm then going to grab this little cookie I have made and slide it in, foil side up, and slide the cable through. I'm then going to get my piece of insulation and push it in at one end, and then as you push it up, you're sort of feeding that cookie into the hole And what you should end up with is this cookie piece here, nicely snug in that hole. And it does mean that when the electrician, if he needs more height, he can just push it and it'll move. But it's also going to help quite a lot of the way to actually reducing the heat loss above the light. You can see that I've done that for a few of these now. And I think it looks really neat. Right, the other thing I've done is just notched out a little bit of this insulation up here. So when I put these spotlights in, the little flaps that come with them don't catch on the side. And as you can see, all of the insulation is now in the walls. And I've got to say, it already feels massively cooler. It is 26 degrees outside. And before putting this insulation in, this room was a bit of a sweatbox. So I'm really happy that this is already working. And before I move on to the next step, which is the vapor barrier, I do actually want to make sure I fill in all of the little cracks in between the insulation and those studs with expanding foam. And that's just to make sure that I'm minimizing the airflow around that insulation. And in order to do that, I've got myself quite a few cans of expanding foam. I've also got myself one of these expanding foam reusable guns. And I am just going to screw this on and work my way around all of those little gaps, making sure that every single bit is filled. Then I'm going to wait 24 hours for all of this to go nice and hard and scrape it all off to make sure it is level, so that when I put the plywood on the walls, it's not going to be bowing out at all. What do you reckon, Bella? We're doing good? Yeah? Good girl. We've also gone around with a Sharpie and marked out where every single joist is, just so by the time we've put this vapor-proof barrier up, we will know where all of these studs are. And for the vapor barrier, we're actually going to be using the excess damp-proof membrane that we've got left over for when we did the concrete base. So after about 1 million staples, we've finally got that vapor barrier on the ceiling. If I'm honest, I'm not sure how much good this is going to do, given the amount of staple holes that are in it, but we've done it now and I figured that it's not going to do any harm. Chris is just going along the edges and cutting the excess off, leaving a bit of an overlap just so when we put the wall vapor barrier up, it's not got any corners to escape into. And that did take a while. It was quite hard work. I imagine it's because we've used this thicker DPM, whereas you can use the thinner stuff. But because of the width of this workshop, which is 2.8 meters, I didn't want to go and buy the 2.5 meter vapor barrier because then I'd had to have put up 2 layers. Here I am back in the workshop a few days later, and I have now got all of the plasterboard that I'm going to need for the roof. Now, luckily for me, the guys down at Evolution actually sent me this. This is their panel carrier. And what this allows you to do is put it on one of these panels, and then the pressure of actually lifting this handle up is enough to grasp it. So you can lift it and then go on your way. And this was super useful because I did have to move all of these panels by myself. So this meant I could actually do it without risking dropping these and damaging them. And I nearly forgot to say that I'm going to be putting every single one of these screws in with a combi drill today and not an impact driver. And the reason for that is if you use an impact driver, there's a good chance that you will welt it right through the plasterboard and actually damage the paper. I've also made sure to connect this drill bit into the end. And this is specifically for putting plasterboard screws into plaster, and it will just prevent it actually going too far into the plasterboard. The last thing to mention here is I am making sure to use these. These are plasterboard screws. These are 42 millimeters long, which is going to be plenty to hold these 9 millimeter thick plasterboards to the ceiling. And all of the products that I'm mentioning throughout this video can be found on my Amazon page, and you can find the link to that in the description of these videos. I've just measured the length that the first plasterboard sheet is going to need to be. And even though I planned for every single one of these to land on a joist, it hasn't quite worked out that way. So this is going to need just a fraction cutting off it. And to do that, I'm going to use a Stanley knife and a straight edge, score it down the edge and it will just come off. And then I'll also make sure to clean that edge down with one of these. This is called a rasp. So you can see that I've used this rasp on this edge. It just sands it off like a cheese grater. and that makes quite a rough edge with the knife, a really nice smooth edge. So that's ready to put up now. You also do want to make sure that when you do this, you're putting all of your cuts where possible against the edges in the corners, and not where the two bits of plasterboard are butted up to each other. And that is just going to make sure that you're maximizing the strength of the factory finished edge instead of a cut edge, which is usually a little bit weaker. So we have just had to take that first board down because it looked like that back wall is bowing out slightly at the top, which means that it's not actually finishing nice and square. And so we're taking a slither off, like a diagonal slither, which should mean that this does actually butt up to all of those edges, and the next board will fit in nicely.
Hopefully.
So that is one board up. You can see that we've got roughly 5 screws running along every single joist, and that is going to be plenty to hold that up. So we're just going to make our way around and do the other 6 sheets, and then this will be done. The next sheet we've got has got to cut out this back box for the socket that I put in the ceiling. So instead of lifting it up there and sort of marking it out up, we're sort of taking the measurements from here to here and here to here, and then transferring them over to this sheet of plasterboard that's going to go up there. And hopefully that will fit nice, but we will see.
And after a lot of consideration, I did decide to put plywood sheets on the wall instead of plasterboard. And that really is just down to the fact that these are going to be a lot stronger. So if I bang anything against the wall, it's going to be fine.
You do want to make sure that you put every single bit of plywood on a piece like this, and that's just going to make sure that you've got an expansion gap below it. So when the wood expands, it's not going to break or crack out the screws. So you can see here that now I have cut this piece of plywood down to the gap where it's fitting. It is fairly good the way it's connected to this board, but there is a little bit of a gap at the bottom here. And ideally, I don't want any gaps. Now, I'm not particularly good at scribing things in, but I'm fairly sure what I need to do is take off the thickness of this gap down here from the top, essentially cutting it at a diagonal, and that should mean that it butts up nicely. So I'm going to mark this out and hopefully get it right. Because if I don't, it means doing a lot of work all over again.
So I need to take off that line down to nothing. So let's see how this goes.
So you can see that scribing that off has reduced that gap to nothing for the majority of it. I mean, there's a slight hairline gap here, but as far as I'm concerned, that's perfect. Just cutting wood in the rain. Now, it may be raining, but I don't mind because 1, I've put a gazebo up so I'm not getting wet, and 2, this next one lands on a full board, so I've only got to make 1 cut.
Slow down, mama, why you talk so mean? Good Lord, Nashville, it ain't what it seems. You got nice clothes, late night shows, boogie down at the bar.
And to be honest with you, it's not cutting these boards down that's the difficult bit. The bit that is most time consuming has got to be cutting out all of the back boxes for every single socket. But at this point, I have done about 13 of them. So I'm going to show you the best method that I have found for doing this. So the first thing that you want to do once you know that your bit of plywood has been cut to size and fits up nicely is guesstimate where that plug socket is. I know that it is roughly behind this piece of plywood just about here. Then you want to have ready a rubber mallet, an offcut of plywood, and either a piece of chalk or what I'm using here, which is just an offcut of plasterboard. Then carefully lean forwards. Just get your piece of chalk or plasterboard and just mark over all 4 of the edges of that back box. Then you want to slide your piece of plywood back into position. Get your rubber mallet and your offcut of wood and give it quite a few hard slaps. Then grab 2 offcuts of insulation. And if you don't have any insulation, just, 2 thick things. And lean your piece of plywood back. Now, it's very hard to pick this up on camera, but I can just about see the indent that has made. So I'm going to now grab a pencil and a ruler and just mark around that area. And I've only got 2 edges, but that should be enough. If I now get a spare back box, just position that on the 2 lines that I've made, then draw around it. So I know that this is the area that I need to cut out with my jigsaw. The other thing that you've got to remember with these back boxes is there is a little bit of metal on all the corners that just stick out slightly. So if you end up cutting it really tight, it's going to catch. So I'd always, on those corners, just go a little bit further than the line. And now I'm going to drill out all 4 corners with a 10mm drill bit. And then I use this jigsaw to cut around the edges, making sure to cut that line clean off. And with that cut out, the last thing I would recommend doing is getting a file like I've got here and just sweeping off all of these edges. And after that, you can test it by just making sure that a back box fits, fairly snug, which it does, in there. So let's put it up and see how all that looks.
Here's the one.
Because I want every single screw to be lined up, I've made myself this little guide here, and I've just marked up every 200mm the entire way along. So I've rested this at the bottom. I'm using a laser level to make sure that I'm holding this straight. And with a pencil, I will just go along, put a little dot everywhere that I need to pre-drill. And then using this very fancy drill bit, I love, by the way, I'll have a link in the description for those that are interested in getting one of these. I'm just going to pre-drill every single hole. And you will notice I've got a screw going everywhere down. I've just skipped the one that was in line with the power sockets. And that's just to make sure I don't go through a cable. Not that I think I would, because I don't think the screws are long enough, but it's better to be safe than sorry. After spending a couple more days putting plywood sheets up on those walls and painting the ceiling, I can finally say that the workshop is pretty much totally done at this point. I am still waiting for the electrician to turn up to finish things like the lights and put the fuse box in, just to make sure all the power will work. And there are other things that I will do. But for the most part, I am totally satisfied with how this workshop is currently looking. And although I am of the belief that a workshop is never truly finished, it's one of those things that will go on and evolve over my entire woodworking journey, I am going to say, for the sake of this series, that this marks the end point. Now, there are a bunch of videos that I want to make on the workshop moving forwards. Probably the next one I'm going to focus on is a video summarizing the cost, and you can watch that video by clicking here next. Until next time, happy building.